Rhino is one of the absolute OG Warframes. Every beginner's wet dream, he got indirectly buffed in 2025, and Bro can also be built to one-hit absolutely everything up to level 10,000 with no complicated setup needed whatsoever. And with my last Rhino video being, old enough to make an update, I guess, today we're not only gonna turn him into an absolute steel path beast, but I also have easy step-by-step beginner builds prepared. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members who helped me keep up the iron skin, and now, let's jump right into it. Now, first things first, because Rhino is one of the absolute fan favorites for early game players, let's first talk about how you can get your greedy little 10-no fingers on him in case you don't have him yet. The overall majority of players will probably acquire him on Venus from the Jackal boss fight right there. That's a mission you need to run a couple of times because this boss drops the blueprints for all the 3 components that you need to build Rhino yourself, that being the chassis, systems, and neuroptics blueprints. Once you have them, you can build them in your foundry, and then walk over to the market console and buy the main blueprint for in-game credits. With that then, and the 3 aforementioned components, you can build the full Rhino Warframe in your foundry. However, that's not the only way. If you are a bit further into the game, I would say roundabout mid-game, you might have already unlocked Deviri, where you can also obtain Rhino from the Deviri circuit rotation. I don't think that's necessarily needed because the Rhino base farm with the Jackal is extremely easy, but one important thing to note here is, if you go for him in Deviri, then as part of this reward rotation, you will also obtain his Augment Mod Ironclad Charge, which is by far the most important augment on Rhino, and especially if you're still a bit earlier in the game, you might not be able to farm it organically because that requires you to rank up your syndicates quite a lot, which takes a lot of time. My personal suggestion is, if you like Rhino and you can't realistically get Ironclad Charge from the syndicates yet, then keep an eye out for his circuit rotation. But now that you know where you can farm Rhino yourself, the next thing I want to talk about would be his abilities so that we're all on the same page about what Rhino can do. However, I want to make a quick disclaimer jumping into it. As you might have noticed in the acquisition part before, I'm going to keep this video a bit more beginner-friendly with the explanations, as Rhino is one of the earliest Warframes that many players get. So, if you're a veteran and you already know everything, then there are timestamps down below. You can just jump ahead to the Steel Path build section later in the video. For everyone else though, let's take a look at his passive first, and well, this is unironically one of the worst passive abilities in the entire game. See, as you probably already know, if you fall down with your Warframe from a certain height, then you'll be stopped in your movement for a bit with your Warframe going And Rhino's passive here is that this will create a little shockwave in a small 6-meter AoE in which enemies will be knocked down. Yeah, that is it. If you maybe have a melee weapon that needs to do a ground finisher, this could potentially be of some use, otherwise we can just forget about it. Rhino's first skill is called Charge, and on the one hand, this ability is one of the most essential of his entire kit, but on the other hand, kind of forgettable. Let me explain. At base, what this does is relatively simple. You charge forward, and if any enemies are unlucky enough to be in your way, they bounce away like bowling pins if you take one of the heaviest bowling balls that you can find and smash them right into them. I think you get the metaphor. As you can see in the middle of your screen, there's also a little combo meter where if you chain together multiple charges, you can increase it up to 4 times, and then consecutive charges will have their range increased by 50% and their energy cost lowered by 75%, making it very affordable to just spam this like crazy. Now, let's be 100% real here. Yes, if you specifically build for it, you can make an argument that Rhino's Charge is actually a pretty decent mobility tool. Especially if you are a very early game player, you just unlocked the Plains of Eidolon, the first open world, and you want to get from A to B as quickly as possible, then yes, ideally you would just use your Arcwing to fly around, but if you haven't acquired that yet, then I can remember that I, back in the day, was a pretty big fan of using Rhino Charge to just cross the distance a little bit faster than I would be able to if I just went on foot normally. However, and I don't want anybody to have any illusions here, the main reason why 99% of the player base will use Charge is for its augment Ironclad Charge that I mentioned in the previous section when I was talking about the Deviri rewards, because this one is unbelievably strong. What it does is, for every enemy that you hit with the charge, Rhino's armor is increased by 50% at base, but this scales with your ability strength, so you can easily get to over 100% armor gain per enemy here. This armor gain is based on the armor that Rhino has the moment he executes the charge. So, in other words, if you buff up your armor like crazy through other means, and then use Ironclad Charge to bump into tons of enemies, then not only will you have a ton of armor to begin with, but this crazy percentage boost that you get from Ironclad Charge will be applied to the already buffed up armor, resulting in absolutely crazy values. Now, you might be wondering, why is it necessary to stack up all that much armor? And to be able to answer that, we first need to talk about his second skill, that is called Iron Skin. Now, Iron Skin. Where do I start? I think everybody kind of knows what this does, right? It's the reason why every new player feels invincible the moment they take their Rhino out on the first spin. Iron Skin, well, coats you in an iron skin. To be more precise, it gives you Overguard, which is a third type of hit point next to health and shields. And the way you can imagine it is that Overguard is kind of like a shield that is applied over your normal health and shields. As long as you have Overguard, your health and shields cannot be scratched by anything, plus you are immune to all types of status effects. Now, the amount of Overguard that Iron Skin gives you scales both with your ability strength, but also, and now we're getting back to the charge augment that we just talked about, it scales with your armor too. Meaning, if you have very, very high armor, the moment you cast Iron Skin, then the Overguard figures that you're generating will be absolutely ridiculous, up into the millions, and we're also going to have a build later on showcasing that. This is what most players do, and it's perfectly viable. However, there's another little detail that I need to mention with Iron Skin here, and that is, after you cast it, you will become invincible for 3 seconds, and all the damage that you've taken within this 3-second time frame will afterwards be added on top of the Overguard for you as well. So if you're a very new player and you don't have Ironclad Charge yet, one thing that I would recommend is jump into the middle of a bunch of enemies and then cast your Iron Skin, so that all the fire that you're taking for the next 3 seconds will lead to you getting much more Overguard out of it. And for all of you who like the meme builds, of course you can also just jump into the Orokin lasers and get a bazillion Overguard that way. However, as nice as all of this sounds, Iron Skin has one big problem. You can't recast it. If you want to fill up the Overguard more, you'll have to wait for it to be shot down to 0 before you can cast it again. At least by default, because there is an augment called Iron Shrapnel that kinda helps with that, because what this does is, it makes Iron Skin recastable, and every time you do recast it, you will deal the remaining Overguard that you still had at this point as AoE puncture damage to all the enemies around you. Now, I'm gonna make it short here. Overall, yes, you can get some nice meme builds out of this, and I think in mid-game this does some pretty decent damage. However, once you go on a steel path and enemies become much tankier, I personally don't think that the damage is worth it. You may disagree, but I am not gonna do that. Skill number 3 is called Roar, and this one is as simple as it gets. Roar is the best damage buffing ability in the entire game. Once you cast it, you will give a damage bonus to yourself and allies in range. However, this damage bonus does not only apply to weapons, but also to abilities, and in that sense it is very unique, as many other damage bonuses in the game simply won't. Also, one thing that makes Roar incredibly freaking strong and convenient is that the damage bonus from Roar is considered universal faction damage. Or in other words, it works the same way as mods like Bane of Grineer do, in the sense that it's considered damage to faction, just that Roar is considered damage against every faction. This is on the one hand great for Skuldra and Tekrot, which at the point of making this video do not have their own faction mods just yet, and on the other hand for everybody who despises using faction mods in their builds, and I know there are a lot of you out there. Roar is just absolutely amazing and allows Rhino to deal tons and tons of damage. Now, Roar also has an augment called Piercing Roar, and this one is pretty interesting. First of all, what it does is it increases the range of Roar, and all the enemies in a 25-meter radius are knocked down, making your passive even further obsolete, and they all receive 5 puncture status effects. Now, just as a quick reminder, what puncture status does is, at the maximum of 5 procs, affected enemies will deal 80% less damage against you and allies, which essentially makes you much more survivable for the duration of those stacks. Plus, you will also receive a flat 25% crit chance bonus against those enemies. So yeah, all in all, I can totally see the intrigue of this mod, not gonna lie, but I personally do not like it enough to dedicate one mod slot for it. I'd say just play around with it and decide for yourself. And finally, let's also talk about Rhino's 4, which goes by the name Stomp, and this is also relatively straightforward. You will stomp the ground, and all enemies in a pretty large area around you will be wildly flung into the air where they sort of hover around for a while, effectively being completely crowd controlled. Now, at first glance, this sounds pretty darn good. However, I do have 2 very big problems with Stomp that I want to take a minute to share with you. First of all, crowd controlling enemies is nice, however, the way that they're lifted into the air, their body posture if you so want, makes it very difficult to headshot them in this state, meaning for ranged weapon players, this is quite the nuisance. And secondly, Stomp costs 100 whopping energy to cast, which is a whole lot if you consider Caliban has pretty much the same ability, just that it lifts enemies up into the air in a way that you can easily headshot them, gives them additional damage vulnerability on top, and it only costs 50 energy to cast. And finally, also Stomp does have an augment called Reinforcing Stomp. What this does is, for every enemy that you hit with the AoE from Stomp, 4% of your maximum iron skin are gonna be refilled. This, if you hit a lot of enemies with a Stomp, can instantly fill up your iron skin back to the max. However, it should be noted, you cannot exceed your maximum iron skin value that you got when you initially casted it. Now, I've seen a lot of posts of people saying that it is actually really darn good and how they would build around it. However, I'm just not a fan of reinforced Stomp builds. For now though, like the video or Rhino is gonna find out where you live and stomp you. Cheers so much for your support. But now that we know what Rhino can do, and everybody who likes Stomp hates me, let's talk about builds where the first segment I want to take some time to talk about beginner applications. I have 2 builds prepared here, one for the very early beginners only a few planets into the star chart, and the second one for those who've already made the step into mid-game, where we can already attempt to make a full build. So let's talk about the builds, and what we have here would be the very early on build. In the aura, we go for Dreamer's Bond, as it is the first aura that you'll ever gain access to. If you already have something else, like for example Energy Siphon, which is one early game favorite of mine, you can totally replace it. I'm just trying to keep it beginner friendly here. Now, since our main survivability will come from Iron Skin, and that scales with ability strength and armor, what we need to do is go for Steel Fiber as well as Intensify. Those 2 mods should be available very early on in the game. However, I do want to mention here, for any early game players watching here, you do not have to max out these level 10 mods all the way to the max. Just try to get them up to like level 5 or something where it's still very affordable, and then further invest into it as you make your way through the game. Up next, we go for Flow to increase our maximum energy right here. Continuity increases our ability duration, which is very nice because that means our Roar buff will stay on longer, 39 seconds with this build. And then finally we go for Equilibrium for the energy economy. What this does basically is, if you pick up a health orb, this will also give you energy, so that is really nice for that extra bit of juice. Finally, if you wanted to, you could go with Vitality to give yourself some more maximum health. I personally think, especially in the early game, it will not be necessary, as by default you're gonna have 4,200 Iron Skin, and that's gonna make you much tankier than whatever health you have here. So if you're struggling with the mod capacity, you could leave Vitality out. Trust me, your Iron Skin has got you covered. So much for the very early game build. However, I have another somewhat beginner-friendly build, this being for the more mid-game players who are not yet into Steel Path, but already deep enough in the game where making a full build is possible. This right here would be it. In the aura, I went for corrosive projection, but also here, this is more an example. You can use whichever aura mod you feel most comfortable with, and in general, the main things that have changed about the build is that we replaced normal intensify with the umbral version, as you will get this from the quest The Sacrifice, which I would consider decently mid-game. If you do not have the umbral mods just yet, you're perfectly free to stick with normal intensify for the time being. Next, and I think this is very important when you want to make the next step into the later game with Rhino, absolutely do try to get Ironclad Charge. This is the top priority for Rhino because it will just give you that much more Iron Skin. And then lastly, I decided to go for Augur Message as well as Augur Secrets, both relatively decently to acquire, just to give some more ability strength and more ability duration for the overall performance. That would be it for the beginner and mid-game section of the video. If you are a somewhat newer Tenno, I hope this was helpful. For the rest of the video though, we are going to talk about higher investment steel path builds. The first one is your super tanky, millions of iron skin steel path weapons platform, and the other one is a very funny interaction that will allow you to one-hit enemies even at level cap while being constantly invisible in the process. Let's though start out with the Iron Skin build, where the first thing I want to talk about would be the Archon shards. And when it comes to the Archon shards on this build, it completely doesn't matter. Like, for real. If you want to have more strength, go into the red ones. If you need more casting speed, go into the yellow ones. If you want to use corrosive to strip away the enemy armor, then well, the green ones will have you covered. And if you want to abandon your family because your kid uses reinforced stomp, then go and buy cigarettes just to never return. It's really up to you. The shards that I use right here are all for the second build, so none of this is required for the Iron Skin build that we're going about now, just as a bit of context. And as a Helminth ability with this build, we're going to go for Parasitic Armor, which actually does not come from any Warframe, but it is from the Helminth system directly. And what this does fits perfectly for Rhino, because when you cast it, it takes your maximum shields, multiplies that by your ability strength, and then adds it on top of your armor value. Remember how initially I said, when you use Ironclad Charge, the armor bonus that it gives you is applied to the armor that Rhino has the moment you cast it? That's the reason why we use Parasitic Armor, to increase that initial base armor as high as possible before applying the buff, which will then translate into millions of Iron Skin points. For the build itself, I actually want to start out with Arcane Tanker right here. What this does is, when you call in your Archon, you're going to receive a 1200 armor bonus for an entire minute. This is perfect at the start of the mission. Just bring it down once, and then you will have this big armor bonus for an entire minute. Then cast your Parasitic Armor to turn all your shields into even more armor. And as a secondary weapon, and that is the reason why Rhino's even better in 2025, we're going to use the Sciotid because you can just shoot it into a blob of enemies and it will neatly group them all together and then Ironclad Charge through them to get as big of an armor bonus as possible. This right here would be the build. As I initially said, Arcane Tanker as a armor bonus, plus we're going to go with Arcane Energize as our source of energy income. In the aura, we go for Growing Power for even more ability strength, but you can replace it with anything else. These 25% here don't really change all too much. In the Exilus, also here you're free to use whatever you like, but I personally find Preparation to be very handy, especially if you have to set up a couple skills in a row at the start of the mission. Next, because we want to have as much armor as humanly possible, and we're using Parasitic Armor, that means we need to get a ton of shields, which we do with Primed Vigor as well as Primed Redirection, and those almost 2000 shields will then be translated into armor when we cast the skill. Since this scales with ability strength, we naturally want to have as much of that as possible, which is why we go for Blind Rage and Transient Fortitude with Umbral Fiber and Umbral Vitality, Prime Flow for the maximum energy, and finally, of course, Ironclad Charge, because without this augment we're not getting an armor bonus for our Iron Skin. Now, with this build being the absolute overkill on your overguard, there is one question that is looming on the horizon. Is it even worth it to have that much Iron Skin? Well, yeah, of course. Big number, what do you think? Do you want to settle just for the participation trophy? Who are you, Oberon main? No, but jokes aside, Of course, you do not need millions of iron skin. If you're just doing a normal steel path build, then this right here is actually what I would personally prefer. With this build right here, you're looking at 300,000 to 500,000 maximum overguard, which is perfectly fine for all steel path applications. And because we're settling for less overguard, that means we don't need parasitic armor anymore as a helmet subsume, which allows us to go for nourish and therefore gain a lot more convenience in so many ways. If I want to take my Rhino into a steel path mission, then this right here is the build that I personally use. But now, before we end the video, let's talk about the, in my opinion, funniest Rhino build that absolutely everybody should try at some point. See, what we're doing right here is, we infuse Revenant's ability Reeve as our helmet subsume. For those of you who've never heard about it, what Reeve does is, you turn into a cloud wall that phases through enemies, and the enemies that you hit, they will lose a certain percentage of their maximum health. This means, no matter if you Reeve an enemy at level 1 or at level 10,000, they will always take the exact same percentage of relative damage, which makes Reeve one of the very few abilities in the game that scales so perfectly with enemy levels that it can one-hit level cap enemies. Now, the problem with that is that you either need a crap ton of ability strength, or you need to go through a whole lot of setup by viral priming the enemies and so on and so forth, which makes it very unattractive to play. However, this Rhino build solves all of that. You can just start the mission, start reaving, and everything is instantly going to start dying in one hit. Let's jump right into it. As our helmet ability, as I just said, we're going to use Reeve, and now the Archon shards that I previously showed you will come into play, because first of all, I went for 2 Tau yellows to give me more casting speed, as this build is very cast heavy and therefore just much more convenient with those shards, and then I went for 3 normal red ones to increase my ability strength overall by plus 30%. This is more than enough. You don't need the 5 Tau ones that you needed when I first showed this type of build on my Revenant back in the day. This right here is much more investment friendly, let's put it like that. On the build itself, what we're focusing on is as much ability strength as possible, as you can also see right here, because we really need that. We need to be over 400%, otherwise Reeve will not get enough damage to one-hit the enemies without viral priming and all that setup. So, what we're doing here is Power Drift, Blind Rage, Transient Fortitude, Augur Secrets, and then Umbral Intensify in combination with another Umbral mod to get 55% out of it. The reason why we go for Umbral Intensify over Precision Intensify, which would buff Reeve even more as it only applies to the 4th ability, is the fact that we not only need to have a lot of strength on Reeve, but also on Roar, because Roar is essential for buffing up our ability damage, and from my testing, it is better to give 55% strength to both of them, rather than just 90% to this one here. Quick stop, post-edit Blacky here. I just found out that I made a mistake in the build section before. You actually do not need a second Umbral mod to increase Umbral Vitality to 55%. It's fine if you just keep it at 44 and instead rather use Stretch, because this will allow you that your Reeve is broader, therefore hitting more enemies. Sorry for that, I only noticed this at the end of the video. Then, we also have Growing Power for another 25%. And in the Arcane slot, we go for Arcane Crepuscular, which gives us another 30% ability strength, but only if we are invisible. So the question is, how do we achieve that? Well, as our companion, we're gonna use Shade, and Shade is great because it makes it that whenever you get close to an enemy, it turns you invisible. That then triggers the 30% additional ability strength from Arcane Crepuscular, and also it massively helps with survivability because if enemy can't see you, then enemy can't hit you. Now, you might be wondering, that's all nice and dandy, but the invisibility will break the moment you fire a weapon. So how are you going to trigger Growing Power that you have as your aura? Very good point. I was thinking the same thing as well until I found out that if you put Duplex Bond on your Shade, then you can be invisible, Shade can be invisible, nobody needs to shoot or attack, but the clones created by Duplex Bond, for some reason, will trigger your Growing Power whenever they shoot enemies. So you get the 25% extra ability strength, kind of like all the time. All you then really need to do is, when the mission starts, cast Roar, and from that point on, you can just spam Reeve as much as you like and absolutely everything is gonna die. no further setup needed. And if you want to have a list of the best Warframes in 2025, then don't miss this video right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Turtle Pier, Ondakanio2, Skylar Bowser, Mihawky, Phil the Meme, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Murasaki, Shadow Lockhart, Trollo Loxon, Houndaris, Patrasader, Boomia1, Mr. Games Plays, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.